Hervé MARITON, you are a member of the French Parliament and also an expert on Russia. But let me ask you about Western Europe before we go on to Russia. Do you think that the crisis over the euro has now been solved?
No, I think we've found what could be solutions. There's a good lead, and obviously a great job has been done in the past days. But all this requires precisions. It also requires political legitimacy. All observers are very attentive that the solution of a crisis should not only be technical, even with the support and with the leadership of executives of European countries, but it should also be a solution supported by the people and by members of parliament. This is obvious in countries such as Germany, for example. They have very strong parliamentary traditions. We don't have that sort of tradition in France. Nonetheless, I believe it is an important part. I was a few days ago in an investors' conference in London, asked to speak in a country dinner that was about France, and all the investors that were here perfectly knew the technicalities of what was going on. They know how to read, but they wanted to be sure that there was sound support and that there was something solid and sustainable beyond the executive's intentions.
Will there be support from the French voters, because you've got a presidential election coming up and also parliamentary elections next year, just after this treaty is supposed to be formalized, and the treaty does actually involve a degree of pooling of sovereignty, which in a sense distances the euro crisis from the voter?
Well, several things. First, indeed, the calendar is very tricky. The treaty is supposed to be signed in March, that's prior to the election, ratified later. So we may explain people that ratification is the decision by the people, but I'm not quite sure that everybody understands the difference between ratification and signature of a treaty. We might be in the sort of difficulty we had in 2005, where some important European issues had been solved early in the year. That was the enlargement of the Union, and then the constitutional treaty came to referendum in May. This is very tricky. We have to understand this situation and we have to explain it first. Second, well, when it comes to explaining why some sort of competence sharing or sovereignty sharing maybe is necessary for Europe, this is very tricky, particularly for us on the right of the political spectrum. I think we've got more to lose on that than the left, actually. The anti-Euro people, those who are pretty much anti-Euro, anti-Europe, many of them are already on the far right with the National Front of Marine Le Pen. Symmetrically, on the left, the situation is that many of those who are anti would be with the far left, Mr. Mélenchon. But when it comes to the evolution of Europe as it's discussed now, I fear that there might be more movement of opinion on the right than on the left, on two reasons. First, we are in power now, they are not. Second is that I think there's a larger part of our electorate who support Nicolas Sarkozy as a leader, who on many issues choose for the right, but who are rather choosy and rather sensitive on European issues. So we have to be very attentive at all the explanations that are necessary, very attentive also to say that, okay, a necessary step has been crossed and this was rather intelligently done, but it does require...
You have your work cut out.
It does require evolution still in Europe. I was saying that to Mr. Levitt. He used the word Europe plus. Well, maybe, but I'm sure many French, particularly in our electorate, want not only more of Europe, they want a better Europe.
Yes. Let me turn, as a final question, to Russia. It seems to me that, in a sense, Russia has been missing from this conference. There's been a lot of talk about the European Union, a lot of talk about governance in general, about Asia, but not about Russia. And there will be a presidential election in Russia in 2012. We just had parliamentary elections, a certain sense of disquiet about Mr. Putin. What is how do you see the Russian political scene evolving and what impact on global governance?
Well, first, Russia is not upmost in the discussions. Nonetheless, there are Russian participants to the conference, and Russia in many ways takes part in the present economic situation as an oil-rich country, buying firms, buying companies in our countries, and taking its share of investment flow and money flow in the fact that they're buying quite a few companies in the West and in Western Europe. But obviously there are important political uncertainties, and if you look at demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg now, you can no longer say that's totally marginal. When you get 20,000, 30,000 people, obviously that's not a large mob, but considering the difficulties of demonstrating in Russia, it is obviously something new that's happening. Probably the upper middle class, which understands that there's a crystal ceiling which it cannot cross, the terrible difference between the upper middle class that wants to be on the move higher and all the oligarchs that hold the power, political power and economic power. That does not necessarily make millions of Russians, and so it does not necessarily endanger the presidential election to come, but it does create a new climate of political and, in a way, economic unrest. Russia is a strong country in the fact that it's a major power, it's a rich country with raw materials, minerals, oil, but it's a weak country on its demography, on its social conditions, and on its political climate. I can't really say what will come out of that. What we know is that the first obvious thing is rather harsh positions on international relations. The fact that Mr. Putin tended to say that all these demonstrations were caused by people from the West, the difficulties to cooperate on the Libyan issue, for example, as we've seen. And so I fear that there might be a more difficult climate between Russia and the West in the weeks and months to come. And I regret that because I am a French MP. I believe my country is in Europe. I am not totally satisfied with the idea that Europe should be the weak and abandoned part of an old continent, and that the world is obviously somewhere else today. But if we want to have a strong Europe tomorrow, that should encompass Russia. But we can say many pleasant things to Russia, but it also requires that Russia should be in cooperative terms with us.
Indeed. Hervé MARITON, thank you very much indeed.